right, well, good morning. We are on week 6 of our chat on our books of our study of apologetics. We've taken a lot of looks at a lot of different things, different excuses, different reasons people give to us for not becoming Christians, and just examining them to see, where our Christianity is based in a rational thought and belief, and that there are answers to the questions that people are asking. And so we're going to continue with that today. Today we're looking at one that, again, comes up pretty regularly, and that is that, why should I become a Christian, or why should I believe in Christianity? Because science has proved that Christianity is not real. And this, by the way, is one that you see and hear quite a bit. Over the last 20 years, there has been a very strong rise in the level of atheism that is out and about and aggressively attacking Christianity because, as they say, science has shown that it can't be real, and that we want to stop, believing in myths. They want to go back to, like, we're all believing in Norse myths or something like that, because science has proved that it's not true. And like I said, if you go on to YouTube, you will find any number of videos and teachings about atheism and why it's the thing to do. 3 gentlemen that you will find quite regularly mentioned would be Richard Dawkins and Sam Harris, and I can't remember the third one, but Dawkins and Harris in particular in the last 20 years have written books. They show up quite regularly on YouTube speaking about atheism and aggressively attacking Christianity and attacking the gospel. And one of the things that they, like I said, they believe is that science proves that Christianity is wrong. So we're going to take a look at that today. And we'll start off with a question I'll ask you guys. Are you able to be an intelligent, scientific thinker and still believe in Christianity?
Yes.
Okay, you are. Good answer. That's true. And, a lot of people will kind of say, well, that's okay for you because you're not a scientist and you aren't trained in physics or chemistry or biology, so why would you believe this, except for the fact that you just don't have the depth of intellectual knowledge that we bring to it. And the first response that I have, one of the best, as a matter of fact, is that to simply say that if somebody's a scientist, they're therefore an atheist, is dead wrong. Science is founded on Christianity, believe it or not. Why do I say that? Because 5-6 centuries ago, when science was just beginning to really start to put a foothold in, when you had the Galileos, the Newtons, when you had them discovering a lot of math, a lot of astronomy and that, all of the men that were doing that were Christians. And the reason they were doing that was because, as Christians, they realized that the Bible taught that God is a God of order, that He is a God who does things rationally, that He is a God, and that knowing that, we can study the world He created, and we can learn about the world He created. We can learn more about Him by doing that. And therefore, they specifically started to look at the world and started to study it. And they started to say, we can understand this. So the first literal 200 years of science, 16th, 17th, even into the 18th century, most scientists were Christians for that very reason. And that's when the basic groundwork for science was laid. Now, you might say, well, okay, that was good 200-300 years ago, but what about today? And the answer is today that there are as many Christians who are scientists today as there ever were. And in fact, we're not just talking about your average run-of-the-mill scientist, but if you were to go back and look at the Nobel Prize, everybody here know what Nobel Prizes are? Mm-hmm. Okay, they offer them in all of the sciences. They're literally among the highest awards that any scientist can ever win in chemistry, physics, biology. You go back between 1901 and 2000, 100-year span, and they've looked and they've studied all of the scientists who won Nobel Prizes there, And out of that period, 75% of the chemists who won the Nobel Prize for Chemistry are Christians. And I don't say that, that we just assume they are, but when you win a Nobel Prize, you have to fill out all kinds of forms. One of the things they ask them is, what do you believe? Do you have any religion? So 75% of the chemistry winners, 65% of the physics winners, 62% of the medicine winners for Nobel Prizes in the 100 years between 1900 and 2000 were Christians, claimed to be Christians. And also, they looked at just the overall numbers, and in that period, the average over all of the prizes was 65%. So there's very good evidence right there that just being a scientist does not mean you cannot be a Christian. And to hold those two together, science does not reject Christianity. We're going to talk a little bit more about that as we get into it, because I want you to see precisely what science does and doesn't do and how it fits. So we're going to start where most people who will say, well, science has disproved Christianity do, and that's with miracles. What are the miracles? Name me the two biggest miracles in Christianity.
Death and resurrection. Resurrection.
Mm-hmm. Yep, resurrection is one. We have a whole holiday, Easter, devoted to it. We have another whole holiday devoted to the other one. Mm-hmm. Christmas. The incarnation, the virgin birth. There are people that look at those and say, these can't be true. These are miracles. They are outside of the natural law. And that leads us to what is the definition of a miracle. And the definition of a miracle is really pretty simple. A miracle is God's intervention in the natural order. You think about resurrection. Somebody dies in the natural order, that's it. It's over. They don't come back. You don't bring them back to life. The resurrection brought Jesus back to life in front of people. Therefore, that's a miracle because that is outside the natural order. You never are going to see that outside of God's intervention in the natural order. So that's why miracles drive scientists crazy, because they're outside the natural order. And so in order to deal with that, we kind of have to understand another thing, and that is this. Science proceeds on an assumption. And the assumption is that whatever events occur in the world, can be accounted for in terms of other events that are just as worldly. So like when I take a glass and hold it out here and drop it on the floor, it's going to fall and it's going to break. And that's part of the natural order. You can tell why it broke, because I was holding it and I let it go, drop down, gravity, it's in. You have an example exactly of what they're talking about. Because ultimately, the scientist has to assume one thing in order to be a scientist and to make science work, and that is there is a natural cause for any event. That's the only thing that science can address. There has to be a natural cause. And if there's not, science can't deal with it. Science has no idea what to do with that. And by the way, that's not a problem. Science is very, very good at tracking things, at looking at them, at understanding them. It's very good at saying, okay, he dropped the glass, why did it fall? And it can tell me all about gravity, and it can tell me when it hit the ground it broke because of the properties of glass that they have studied and they've looked at and they understand that. It can tell me it broke because it hit a rock instead of a cushion, because the rock has a certain character about it that they've studied, and the cushion has a different character. And science, given its due, is very, very good.
It's funny you brought up the gravity. Isaac Newton, he was a Christian as well.
Yep. Yes, he is.
First law of physics.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
Law of motion.
Yep. Exactly. And by the way, does anybody know how he discovered it?
Apple, wasn't it?
Mm-hmm. Supposedly, he was out taking a break from his work and sitting under an apple tree, and an apple dropped on his head. And it hit him, and whether it's God or not, but he said, now why does the apple fall? And he started to think, and he started to research, and he was a great mathematician, by the way.
Oh, yeah.
So he was getting deeply involved in heavy-duty math that I don't even want to go to. But he was able to prove mathematically what gravity was, and that it existed.
I wish you'd use an apple to get my attention.
I was just saying, I wouldn't even gone there. I would have just been like, I was hungry.
Oh, Lord, thank you.
Yeah.
You know,
Don't even care.
he gave me an apple.
Free apple, not questioning.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And, but he knew natural causes and the rest of that. But the thing with science is this, if science cannot devise an experiment or a test to prove something, then it can't deal with it. And so, what kind of experiment or test do you devise to check for resurrection? They don't have one. They can't have one because it's out of the realm of nature. See, science is very good at explaining something, but it's not good at explaining the why of it. And let me just give you a very simple example that a very wise man once did. If you go into a kitchen and there's a chocolate cake sitting on the counter, and that's it, you just see the chocolate cake on the counter. Science can look at that chocolate cake and it can tell you what its ingredients were, how it was made, what temperature it was cooked at. They can tell you everything about that chocolate cake, except for one thing, why it's there. There's no way that it can say why the chocolate cake is there. So when your Aunt Clara comes in and picks up the cake and says, "Happy birthday," your Aunt Clara is smarter than any scientist. She knows why the cake is there because it's your birthday, and that's it. And we laugh, and it is, it is kind of a funny example, but it's pure gold because that tells you that science can explain to you everything that happens. It can't explain to you at all why something is there. It can't explain to you, like we said, the apple drops, it's gravity. Newton, learns it, but science can't explain where the apple came from. Ultimately, there's no way it knows. And so when science starts to make claims about Christianity, it is dealing not in scientific fact, it is dealing in philosophical thought. And there are two assumptions that lie behind any scientist who tells you that miracles are impossible. One, there's no way to test. He can't tell you why miracles are impossible. He cannot say, we've proven that miracles are impossible right there. His assumption is this. That since I can't make a test or an experiment to prove the miracle happened, therefore it can't exist. And he's gone one step too far. He can only tell you that I can't devise a test and tell you why. But when he goes to say, and therefore because I can't do that, it can't exist. He's making a philosophical assumption. He is making an assumption about,
I was going to say, that's the most unscience thing I've ever heard.
Exactly. But that's the unspoken assumption, though, behind a lot of atheists, a lot of sciences, people who say, well, science has proved Christianity wrong because they can't prove that miracles happen. No, they can't prove miracles happen. But that doesn't mean miracles don't happen. And science can't go and say, because we can't prove it, therefore it doesn't happen. And if you think about it, there is an assumption here. There are two assumptions, really. One assumption is, like I said, they assume that since it can't be proved, it can't happen. Therefore, no incarnation, no resurrection, nothing. And the other assumption that lies even behind that is that there cannot be a God who does miracles. And that's usually the unspoken one, but it's always what lies behind it. That's why atheists love this so much. There's this unspoken assumption that if miracles are impossible, there can't be a God who performs miracles. And so, voila, religion can't exist. Religion is a myth. Religion is wrong. And so that's when, all of a sudden, scientists go from being fact-based, objective, testing people, to faith believers. Because to say that miracles are impossible just because you can't prove it is a faith statement. You can't prove it. And so therefore you're taking it on faith. And to go beyond that and say that there cannot be a God who does miracles is an even bigger statement of faith. And so all of a sudden the scientists are in the same position that we are. They're relying on faith to make their assumptions. And when you're relying on faith, that's where we can come in, that's where we can discuss. But we can't say, they can't say, you believe a myth for those reasons. So that's why, we really, when we think about science, science is a wonderful thing, but always, when you hear people saying science disproved Christianity or science proves this, that, or the other thing, always look for the assumption behind what they're saying. If they can test for it and if they can show you the experiments and if it's a repeatable thing, then it's good science, good facts, good things you can base on, and it's a wonderful thing. But if they're saying that this proves that life can come from non-life, or if they're saying this proves that miracles don't exist, or this proves that there is no God, then no. They're stepping out and they're taking a step too far. They're making a faith-based statement. Now, let me stop there. Sometimes going through this is a little bit difficult, just because, science and the rest of that can be a little bit deep and a little bit scary. But let me ask, are there any questions at this point? Any thoughts or?
As far as science is concerned, it's only designed to look at the natural order.
Mm-hmm.
It can't go beyond that because of the way you have to go about science. And it's been broken down into three parts: observable, repeatable, and verifiable evidence. That's this means of acquiring information.
Mm-hmm. And a scientist would just stay in their lane.
Mm-hmm.
We got no problem with science, and in fact,
I was just thinking, science is the faithiest religion of them all.
yes.
Because they've yet to recreate anything close to evolution.
Yep.
And yet, we're supposed to blindly believe the theory that is not repeatable.
Mm-hmm.
They can't reproduce true things like volcanoes and earthquakes. They can reproduce a replica of something by man-made shaking of it, but they cannot actually produce any of these things that we're just supposed to take their word for. That no one trust us. If we had 1 million years, we could recreate this.
And that's not repeatable.
There-
Yeah, you're right. And, that's why I said, if they would stay in their lane, just, with what they can prove, be verified, like you said, we got no problem with that. And in fact, I would suggest that indeed, that means science and Christianity work together like this. That's why 65% of your Nobel laureates in 100 years were Christians, because they firmly believe that science is designed by God to deal with nature and with natural things, and that God has created a world, a life, everything around us, nature, specifically to be understood by us. So He gave us brains and that, and so we can study it and we can learn about it. It's just that you stop when you start saying this is why it is. You can't do that.
There was an atheist, I think, or a paleontologist. He found now this is the thing that makes it threw a whole wrench in the time span of dinosaurs, so to speak. But he found a Tyrannosaurus skeleton with soft tissue in it, and some Christian organization caught wind of it, and they offered to pay for the radioactive carbon dating on it, and he refused to let them do it because it would shake his whole idea, or
Mhm.
it would shake his whole philosophy.
Yep. Exactly right.
But yeah,
All right, so why do we then see, the sort of the conflict between science and Christianity? And when I say conflict, I mean, people lining up on one side or the other, really going hammer and tongs, fighting about it. And the reason is, believe it or not, that, it's almost a setup. Christianity does not have to be in conflict with science whatsoever. Like you say, Christians firmly believe that if you can test it, if you can do it, that it's going to come ultimately around to pointing to God. Science, astronomers, people that look at the heavens and study them, marvel more and more at precisely how close the tolerances are, and they literally look at that, and many of them, even if they don't go any further, believe there has to be some kind of intelligent design behind it. The world sits, our little globe sits in a narrow band. They call it the golden medium. But if we are, I think they say, about 100,000 miles further from the sun, life couldn't exist, because the temperatures, the cold, and everything would forbid it. If we are 100,000 miles closer to the sun, exactly the opposite. The Earth sits in precisely a place where life can develop and survive and go along. And, if you look at that, it's utterly amazing. That has to be, that can't be an accident. But they have to say that it is, if they're going to, if there is no God. It has to be, it just happened by accident that, that speck of dust that becomes the Earth sits in the right place at the right time and that.
Turns at the right speed.
Yeah, exactly. And, if
it's like
you
a
look
clock,
at,
isn't it?
yeah, if you look at celestial mechanics, God talks in the Psalms, he says, look at the heavens and see my handiwork. When you see the way the heavens move and how everything works together, you can't help but believe there has to be a designer, an intelligent designer. And so, there shouldn't be that, this conflict, but people like conflict. And so there really is, people that want to pick a fight, with Christians, or Christians want to pick a fight with science.
I was gonna say, whether you've heard of the Shroud of Turin, right?
Mm-hmm.
Whether you believe in it or not, they had they were allowed to. They had 8 scientists that were all. The person that started it wanted all skeptics,
Mm-hmm.
and not one of them could explain how that thing happened,
Exactly.
because it was burned into the
Mhm.
as old as it was burned into the fabric. Yeah, it was.
Yep. And I would suggest, by the way, that, like I said, I don't believe that all science is in conflict with Christianity. I believe that, if you've got a child that is good in physics or chemistry or math or whatever, and they want to study science, push them. Tell them to do it. Study it, because it's not ultimately going to affect or challenge their Christianity. Now, people out there might try and do that. You can, there are scientists and scientific teachers who just despise Christianity on a personal level, not a scientific level, but will go out of their way to say, well, if you're a Christian, you can't be a scientist. John Frame, who I mentioned before in here, one of the greatest mathematical minds of the century, teaches at Oxford, and that when he came to Oxford and was getting his advanced degrees in mathematics, they pulled him aside and they said to him, if you expect to advance in math, you have to give up your Christianity. And I don't mean that they just kind of hinted at it. He was pulled into the head of the department and the dean's office at Oxford and told Christianity is not compatible with science. You have to give it up. He didn't, luckily, but you will see that. But that's not because, like I said, he was able to realize Christianity and science aren't in conflict. This is more of a personal thing. But yeah, so that's why I say, you got children who are into math, science, please encourage them, put them into it. So, and we aren't going to deal with evolution so much today, but we are in about 3 chapters going to take a look at that, because Keller goes into a whole chapter dealing with with the issue of evolution, and does it disprove the Bible? And no, it does not. It's properly understood. Evolution doesn't disprove anything. A lot of good scientists out there, a lot of good biologists who are Christians will say, yeah, we see evolution. What's wrong, though, is that too many evolutionists will say that the fact that life starts from a single-celled animal and that it just proceeds naturally through, that's what's wrong. Because there is no proof that it did start just with one single cell. However, if you look, you see evolution at work all the time. But it's evolution within species. It's not outside of species. So if you look at dogs, how many different dog types do we have these days that we didn't have 50 or 100 years ago?
They started with 7.
Yeah.
And now we have hundreds.
Exactly, and that's an example of evolution within a species, and you see it all the time. Things evolve. You can make them evolve. You look at plants and you look at agronomy. It's amazing how the scientists can look at genes and they can move genes, and how they can just do that and change what a plant does. And where did that all start? Started with a little monk by the name of Gregor Mendel, who was raising peas in the monastery garden, and who looked and he said, some of the peas over here taste sweeter than some of the peas over here. Why is that? And so he started mixing and matching plants and putting them together, and he literally laid the groundwork for the science of genetics just by doing that in his little monastery garden. And he was a perfectly good Christian. Maybe he was a monk, but he was a good Christian. But he was able to evolve the peas that he was growing for the monks in his garden until he was growing the finest peas in the land. And people were coming to him. They were asking, can you give us plants from your garden so we can start growing them? But that's just an example of why you see evolution on a micro scale. Macroevolution, that's a different thing. And that's where we get back to the whole thing we were talking about at the beginning. They always like to say, well, life started with a one-cell creature that divided and evolved over 13 billion years into what we see today. But what they can't tell us, how did you get the one-cell creature? What was the first one-cell creature? Where did it come from? When you ask them that question, that'll stump them, because they can't tell you that. Can't tell you that at all. It's the same in astronomy. You look at the sky and the stars, and the sun and the moon and everything else, and they say, and they can tell you how they move, how fast they move. Good Lord, they can, tell you how to launch a rocket so that it gets to Mars in the certain time. And when you launch it one day, 9 months later, it's going to land at exactly the right spot where it needs to be, because they know the math, they know the celestial mechanics, they know all of this. And when you ask them, wonderful, where did it come from? Big Bang Theory came from the Big Bang. Wonderful. Where did whatever it was that blew up come from?
I was going to say, the Big Bang Theory isn't necessarily false, it's just maybe not the way they think it is.
Well, exactly. They're lost because we're back to the cake. They can tell you, how the cake was made, and they can tell you all kinds of things about it, but they sure can't tell you why. And so, where did it come from? And so and like I said, we'll talk more about that in a couple of weeks. Let me just close with this, though. When we're dealing with miracles, and that really is what this is all about, science can't handle miracles. They just, miracles are something that are so far out of their understanding and the way they're trained to think that they can't deal with them. And a lot of people are like that, and it's understandable because even for us as Christians, miracles sometimes are a difficult thing to deal with. I mean, let's face it, you and I as Christians believe that a guy went to the cross, literally died on the cross after being poked with a sword, knowing he was completely dead, and 3 days later came back to life. And now it came back to life that he was going around, he was coming up to people who knew him, he was teaching, preaching, and doing all of these things, and then went back to heaven. That's a pretty weird belief when you get right down to it, if it's not true. But if it is true, then it's important. But people do struggle with it. And let me give you an example. Turn in your Bibles, if you will, to the book of Matthew, all the way to the end of Matthew chapter 28. Short passage. It's right where we have what they call the Great Commission, Matthew 28. But we're going to look at the two verses before the Great Commission, verses 16 and 17. And this is after the resurrection. We've had Matthew telling us about it, and this is a few days later. If you remember, Jesus, before he died, told the disciples, I'm going to go to the cross, I'm going to die. He said, and I want you to meet me again in Galilee. And they had no clue what he's talking about before the crucifixion. It's like, we're going to meet you in Galilee, and you're here. But yeah, no idea that he was going to die. So, Jesus tells Mary when he comes from the tomb, go tell the disciples, I am risen, meet me in Galilee, because that's where they were going to meet. Verse 16. Now the 11 disciples went to Galilee, to the mountain to which Jesus had directed them. And when they saw him, they worshipped him. And look at these last three words. But some doubted. And remember, we're not talking about casual disciples, casual Christians. We are talking the 11 apostles that were left, the ones who had walked with him, the ones who had seen everything, the ones who had seen him in the upper room already. And it says, even here, but some doubted. Miracles are something, it's not a bad thing to struggle with. Now, hear me clearly. When I say struggle with, I don't mean deny. We don't deny it. They didn't deny that a miracle had happened. The apostles aren't saying, no resurrection. I can't believe that. There must be some other explanation for why Jesus is here. But they did struggle with it. And put yourselves in their position. You've gone literally 3 days from seeing the Messiah you believe totally in die, and they knew he was dead, die on the cross, buried, and then 3 days later show up on their doorstep saying, it's me, let's share some fish. Look, feel, touch, see, it's me. And the mental whiplash that would cause any of us is something that would be difficult. And they have to be sitting there, like it says here, they see him, they feel him, they know it's him, but how? And that's what they're struggling with. Having said that, he just goes on after that, and what does it say? And Jesus came and said to them, all authority in heaven and on earth has been given to me. Therefore, go, make disciples of all nations, baptizing them in the name of the Father and the Son and the Holy Spirit, teaching them to observe all that I have commanded you. Behold, I am with you always to the end of the age. He knows their doubts. He knows their struggles with him being resurrected. But he goes on and says, and go out now and spread the message, spread the news. And they do. And the church is born, and it spreads, and here we are today. So, when a scientist doubts the resurrection, the incarnation, understand it's a pretty big thing to deal with, even for us as Christians, even for apostles who were there and saw it firsthand and felt it. It was difficult to deal with, but it didn't stop them. And their belief carried them through. So, let me just leave it with that for right now. And say one other thing. We've been talking pretty much, like I said, about the resurrection and the incarnation. But if you think about the miracles that Jesus is doing, he does healings. He raises somebody from the dead. He feeds the 5,000, things like this. What are the miracles doing? What are the reasons why Jesus is doing this? And why do they work the way or why is he doing them? I'm going to suggest two things. First of all, Jesus himself tells us the miracles are signs. And when I say signs, I mean just like a sign on the street. They're designed to give you information to point you someplace, to point you in the right direction. When you see a sign that says 30 miles Ames on this road, it's pointing you in the right direction where you want to go. Jesus, when he does miracles, is doing those as a sign that point to him and say, this is God incarnate. This is the Messiah. This is the one who was to come. But there's another thing that he's doing. When he does a healing, when he feeds people, when he raises someone from the dead, what he's doing is something that scientists would like to do. He's restoring the natural order. When he sees somebody who is blind, whether it's they're born blind or it's an accident, and he heals them and gives them their sight, he's restoring them to what they should have been all along, whole. He's restoring them to their sight. When he feeds people, when he feeds the 5,000, he's restoring them to what the natural order should be. When Adam and Eve were walking in the garden, they weren't worried about planting crops. They weren't worried about anything else. They were simply told by God, take care of the garden and eat what you want. Everything's taken care of. You can eat,
Stay away from the tree of knowledge.
Yeah, well, exactly. But, that was the natural order. We wouldn't have to worry about getting food. We wouldn't have to worry about there not being enough. We wouldn't have to worry about eating, It was all right there for us. He's restoring the natural order. When he raises somebody from the dead, same thing. People were not meant to die. You and I were not meant to die. You go back to Adam and Eve. When they were created for fellowship with God for eternity. Now, they didn't have eternity because they rebelled. They chose to turn away from God. But along with the tree of knowledge they weren't supposed to eat of was also the tree of life in the garden, which, if they ate of it, would grant them eternal life, and which God would have had them eat of if they managed to do what they were supposed to do. But my whole point is, they were in the garden. They weren't supposed to go hungry because there was food abundantly supplied without their necessary, without them doing it. God was giving it to them. They were in the garden to walk, talk, and fellowship with God for eternity. He would design them for his presence and his companionship to be with him. They were in the garden and they were perfectly healthy. There were no diseases around. They weren't having to worry about accidents. There was nothing that they had to worry about. And then we fell. And so when God heals, when he raises from the dead, when he feeds, he is restoring the natural order to what it should be rather than what it is. So bear that in mind, and I'll close with that unless there are questions. Anybody wants to ask?